Some battles aren't fought with fists, they're fought with paperwork, chainsaws, and arrogance. For me, it started the day the HOA led by Olivia Johnson decided my hillside forest was just unused land standing in the way of her pet project, a community overlook. That forest wasn't decoration, it was protection. Its roots held back a wall of clay and stone that had stood longer than the HOA itself. But Olivia didn't care. She waved her clipboard, smiled that smug HOA smile, and sent in her crews. I warned her again and again, cut down the forest and the slope will fall. She laughed. Then the storms came. And when the earth finally gave way, it didn't bury my house. It buried hers. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now, and make sure you're subscribed because you don't want to miss how this HOA drama turned into nature's ultimate revenge. I bought my house on Alder Ridge 15 years ago after 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. My name is Robert Williams, and I wasn't looking for neighbors, newsletters, or the kind of community events that required matching t-shirts. I was looking for quiet, something to put distance between me and the noise that followed me home from deployments. I thought I'd found it at the edge of a new development, a neat little neighborhood with shiny mailboxes, lawns trimmed to exact measurements, and of course an HOA. At first the rules didn't bother me. Keep your grass cut, paint your shutters approved shades, pay your dues. Fine. I wasn't here to pick fights over mulch color. I kept to myself. My companions were a couple of dogs, a bow for deer season, and the forest rising behind my property like a wall of green silence. That forest wasn't part of the HOA's common land. It was mine, deeded with the house, 3 acres of hillside, thick with oak, pine, and cedar. To anyone else, it was just trees on a slope. To me, it was a sanctuary. The roots held the soil in place, the canopy kept runoff in check, and the land itself kept my mind steady. I learned the paths the deer carved through the brush. I knew where foxes denned and where owls nested. Every morning before coffee, I walked that slope. It was the only place my nightmares didn't follow me. I would rest my palm against the trunk of an old oak. I called the sentinel, its bark rough, its roots anchored deep into clay. That tree had stood for centuries. I thought it would stand for centuries more. But silence doesn't last long in places with neighbors. The first sign of trouble came with pink and orange ribbons tied to branches at the far ridge. I found them one morning on my walk. Plastic flags bright against the bark. Survey markers. Kneeling, I saw fresh tire tracks, mud pressed deep by a pickup that had no business up there. The second sign came from the sky, the buzz of a drone swooping low, nosy, and mechanical, hovering above my forest like it belonged to the clouds. I didn't need a briefing to know what was coming. I'd seen too many projects pushed forward by people with plans bigger than their understanding. A week later, the letter came HOA stationery, neat serif font, the kind of smug formatting that screams authority even when it's nonsense. As part of our community enrichment plan, it read, "The Alder Ridge Homeowners Association is pleased to announce a proposal to expand our walking trail network and add a scenic overlook. This may require vegetation management in bordering parcels. We look forward to your cooperation." Vegetation management. That was their polite way of saying clear cutting. My forest, my land. I called the HOA office the next morning. The receptionist chirped her way through a script, promised a call back. It never came. So I drove down to their office, tucked between a frozen yogurt shop and a Pilates studio. Inside, the air smelled like toner and cheap perfume, and that's when I met her, Olivia Johnson, president of the board. She was in her late 40s, her hair shellacked into place like a helmet, lips painted a red too sharp for daylight. She smiled when she shook my hand the way politicians smile when cameras are watching. Behind her smile was steel, or maybe just arrogance. "Mr. Williams, I understand you've received the proposal," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I did," I replied, staying on my feet. "It reads like you're planning to bulldoze my forest." She laughed, a sound rehearsed for HOA meetings. "That's a little dramatic. We're just cleaning up a fire hazard, opening the space for everyone." "It's not just about you. It's my property," I said evenly. "And that forest isn't just pretty trees. Those root systems are holding back thousands of tons of wet clay. If you cut them, you're inviting a landslide." She tilted her head, lips still curled. "We've had professional assessments done, licensed, insured, perfectly safe." "Did those assessments include rainfall data, soil stability? Because on slopes like this, one storm can move an entire hillside." Her smile flickered for just a second, then came back sharper. "With all due respect, I know you're retired military and I appreciate your service. But this has already been voted on. The board approved it unanimously. It wasn't your vote to make. If you're concerned, you may want to consult a lawyer. She stood ending the meeting like a judge banging a gavel. I stared at her. She was so sure of herself, so sure that her scenic overlook, her benches, her little ribbon-cutting ceremony would be worth the cost. But I'd seen what happened when men thought they could outmatch nature. Afghanistan, Iraq, floods, landslides, broken earth swallowing entire villages. And now, here was Olivia Johnson, clipboard in hand, thinking she was bigger than a mountain. I left that day not defeated, but with a feeling I hadn't had in years. The same sense I'd felt before ambushes, when the air thickens, when you know something's coming and no one else will listen. That evening I stood by the sentinel oak as the sun bled gold through its branches. My dog sat at my feet. I pressed my palm to the bark, rough and warm. "I'll fight for you," I whispered. 2 weeks later, the rumble of diesel engines rolled down my street. It was 7:06 a.m. on a Tuesday. While most neighbors sipped lattes in spotless kitchens, I heard the growl of machines. I stepped outside in boots and flannel, the morning air heavy with diesel and arrogance. 3 white trucks idled near the slope, men in neon vests unloading cones and gas trimmers. A backhoe loomed at the tree line, its bucket gleaming like a guillotine. And there she was, Olivia Johnson, high-heeled boots, sinking into soft grass, clipboard in hand, lips pursed in satisfaction. "Olivia," I called, voice flat. "What's this phase 1, she chirped, turning toward me like I was a neighbor asking about trash pickup. "Just brush clearing today. Full removal starts Friday. You're on my land." She didn't look up from her clipboard. Actually, we had the boundaries resurveyed. According to the updated plat map filed with the county, this portion falls under HOA easement rights for improvement. "Easement," I repeated. "That's for utilities, sidewalks, not forests." "Well," she said sweetly, "there seems to be a discrepancy. You're welcome to challenge it legally, of course. But that won't stop progress." Then she turned to the foreman and said, "Start with the lower slope. Avoid large trunks until permits are finalized." 2 workers approached the tree-line trimmers, roaring. The first bite of blade against brush sounded like betrayal. "You're making a mistake," I warned, stepping closer. "You don't understand what you're messing with." She glanced up, eyes sharp. "Mr. Williams, change is hard for some people, but you've enjoyed your private woods long enough. This is for everyone now." I took a step forward, my jaw clenched. "You're not listening. Those trees hold this slope together. You cut them, you bury half this neighborhood." She laughed, brittle as glass. "It's not a mountain, it's a hill. Don't be theatrical. It's wet clay under that soil. Clay on a steep incline. You're not building an overlook, Olivia. You're building a landslide." Her smile thinned. "If you obstruct, we'll file a restraining order." "Don't test us, Robert." She only used my first name when she wanted to cut deep. I turned and walked away before I did something I'd regret. But the sound of trimmers followed me, chewing through decades of growth like paper. Every cut echoed in my chest. That night I pulled out the manila folder I'd kept since moving in. Original deeds, surveys, environmental reports. One line in bold from a county engineer years ago: "Vegetation removal on the slope is strongly discouraged due to high landslide risk." I scanned it all, uploaded it to the cloud, sent copies to my lawyer Arthur, sent a polite email to the HOA attaching every document reminding them that trespass is trespass. No reply. Not even a read receipt. The next morning, taped to my front door was a violation notice. "Unkempt yard. Vegetation overgrowth. $200 fine due in 14 days." It wasn't subtle. It was war. And Olivia Johnson had just fired the first shot. The morning after that violation notice, I stood on my porch staring at the crisp piece of paper taped to my door as if Olivia Johnson herself had marched over in her designer heels to nail it there. Unkempt yard. Vegetation overgrowth. $200 fine due in 14 days. I almost laughed, but it wasn't funny. This wasn't about weeds or overgrowth. This was about intimidation. She wanted me distracted, tangled in petty fees while she stripped the hillside bare. I pulled the paper down, folded it neatly, and slid it into my manila folder with the deeds and surveys. Evidence. Everything from now on would be documented, every letter, every flag, every chainsaw cut through bark. I'd learned long ago that battles aren't won by yelling the loudest. They're won by gathering proof piece by piece until the other side collapses under the weight of its own lies. That evening I walked the slope again. The air smelled different, diesel fumes laced with pine sap. I traced my boots along the edges of fresh cuts where ferns and underbrush had once thrived. The soil looked raw like an open wound. My dog sniffed nervously at the churned mud. The sentinel oak stood tall, but I could see daylight where the brush used to blanket its roots. My stomach sank. I called Arthur, my lawyer. He was a quiet man with a sharp brain, someone who preferred facts to theatrics. I've got surveys, deeds, environmental warnings, all showing this slope is mine, I told him. Good, he replied. Keep photographing. Date stamp everything. If they cross your boundary, that's trespassing. We'll hold them accountable. But paper alone doesn't stop saws. The next morning, trucks rumbled in again. Men in neon vests unloaded chainsaws, trimmers, and stakes. And there, standing in the middle of my forest like she owned the earth, was Olivia Johnson clipboard in one hand, coffee cup in the other, barking instructions like a general in lipstick and pearls. I approached calm but firm. You're trespassing, I said. She didn't even look up. Actually, Robert, our updated plat map shows this section as HOA easement, perfectly within our rights. That plat map is wrong. I've got the original deed. Then you can bring it up with your lawyer. She turned to the foreman. Clear to the lower slope first. Avoid the big trunks until permits are confirmed. A chainsaw roared to life. The sound was primal, splitting the morning. A man drove it into a young cedar, and within seconds the tree was gone, felled like it had never existed. My fists clenched. You're destroying a safety barrier, I warned, raising my voice. These trees are the only thing keeping this hillside stable. Olivia finally looked up her lips, twisting into that smug smile. Robert, you've enjoyed your private forest long enough. It's time to share. The community deserves this overlook. This isn't sharing. It's reckless. You're being theatrical again. It's a hill, not Everest. You think you're building a park. You're building a mudslide. She stepped closer, eyes flashing. If you interfere again, we'll file for a restraining order. And don't think for a second the board will take your side. I stood there staring at her, every instinct screaming at me to push back harder. But then I remembered Afghanistan ambushes that started with shouting and ended in blood. This wasn't the place for fists. This was the place for patience. That night, I called in a favor. Robert Miller, a geotechnical engineer I'd served with years ago. He owed me more than one. The next morning, he came out with a toolkit and a serious face. He ran soil tests, took core samples, and walked the slope with a frown. Finally, he knelt by the retaining wall near my garden and tapped the concrete with a hammer. Compromised, he said flatly. These roots were the only thing keeping the clay stable. One big storm and this slope is going to move. And guess whose house sits directly in the flow path I already knew? Olivia's. Can you put that in writing? I asked. He nodded. I'll draft a statement tonight. I had the proof now: deeds, environmental reports, and a professional engineer's warning. I scanned them all, emailed copies to the HOA, and CC'd the county planning office. No excuses. They couldn't say they hadn't been warned. 2 days later, I received another notice on my door. Unauthorized modifications affecting HOA aesthetics. $400 fine. They were referring to the erosion fabric I'd quietly laid over part of the slope, trying to shield it from further runoff. The HOA didn't care about safety. They cared about control. Neighbors started whispering as they passed my driveway. Isn't that your forest back there? One asked nervously. Did they really get permission? Another muttered. I thought that land was protected. I didn't answer. Not yet. I was waiting for the right moment, the moment when Olivia's arrogance collided with reality. That moment came 4 days later. I was walking the slope at dawn when I noticed it, a hairline crack running along the base of my retaining wall. It hadn't been there the day before. I crouched, pressed my palm against the soil. It felt soft. Too soft. My chest tightened. By noon the sky darkened, and the first drops of rain fell. Thin at first, then heavier. By evening, sheets of water poured down the hillside. My French drains, dug years earlier, carried runoff away from my garden, but I could see it pooling near the stripped slope above. Gullies carved themselves into the bare clay thin rivers, slicing deeper with every hour. I grabbed my camera, filming every second. The water funneled downhill straight toward Olivia's backyard. The next day she held a press event. Yes, a press event. A coffee cart, string lights, neighbors in folding chairs, all gathered at the edge of what used to be forest. Olivia, hard hat perched on her lacquered hair, waved at cameras like she was breaking ground for a monument. Behind her, the stump of my sentinel oak still bled sap. Today marks a bold step forward, she announced, handing out glossy brochures. Alder Ridge will now have a scenic overlook, a gathering place for all our residents. Safety measures are already in place. Our community is stronger than ever. I stood in the crowd, arms crossed, mud clinging to my boots. She didn't mention the runoff pooling behind her own fence. She didn't mention the crack in my retaining wall. She didn't mention Robert Miller's report sitting unread in her inbox. As she posed for photographs, I turned away. Let her have her moment. The land would answer soon enough. That night, I sat at my desk under the glow of a single lamp, organizing everything: soil, composition, data, rainfall, records, survey, maps, Miller's signed statement. I emailed them again, this time not just to the HOA, but to the county and to every resident through the neighborhood's online portal. Then I printed 20 copies and slipped them into mailboxes. If Olivia wanted to ignore me, fine. But the people living under that slope deserved to know what was coming. For 2 days, silence. No replies, no phone calls, no knocks at my door. Then, on the third day, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was a cease and desist letter from the HOA's law firm, accusing me of spreading panic and defaming the board. Alongside it was an escalation of fines, $600 now. They thought this was a game. They thought they could bully me into silence. But this wasn't a game, because as I looked out my window that night, rain once again hammering the roof, I saw something move on the slope. A stump twisted free from the ground, pulled out like a rotten tooth. The earth shifted, groaned, then held. Not yet, but soon. And when it came, no lawyer, no clipboard, no HOA bylaw would stop it. The storm that night was only the beginning. I sat awake watching the security monitors glow in the dark of my study. Every gust of wind sent branches rattling against the siding. Every downpour hammered the gutters until they overflowed. My dogs, usually brave, paced nervously by the door. At 3:12 a.m., the camera caught its soil slumping near the lower slope, water sheeting over exposed clay like oil sliding off glass. A stump leaned, cracked, and toppled. Then the earth held as if taking one last breath before the inevitable. At dawn, I walked out in my boots, flashlight still in hand. The rain had thinned, but the damage was clear. Rivulets carved trenches into the hillside. The crack in my retaining wall had widened to nearly half an inch, and the soil beneath it felt spongy. My heart sank, not for me, but for the rows of houses downhill. They weren't just strangers anymore. They were people who waved to me, people whose kids sold cookies at my door. And Olivia Johnson's 2-story showpiece, her pride and joy, stood directly in the path of gravity. I called Robert Miller, the engineer. He came with his equipment, mud up to his knees, shaking his head before he even unpacked. The slopes compromised, Robert. Roots are gone, soil saturated, and that clay isn't holding. One major storm and the whole hillside could slide. How bad, I asked. He looked toward Olivia's house, its balcony jutting out like a dare to nature. Bad enough to bury her living room. I didn't flinch. Put it in writing. By evening, I had Miller's signed statement. I scanned it, emailed it to the HOA board, CC'd the county planning department, and hand-delivered copies to several neighbors. The message was clear: the land was unstable and lives were at risk. The response: another violation notice taped to my door. Unauthorized communications inciting community unrest. $500 fine. They weren't just ignoring me, they were punishing me for warning people. But something shifted after that. A neighbor from 3 houses down slipped a note into my mailbox. Saw your report. Our backyard is already flooding. What should we do? Another texted anonymously. Foundation cracks showing. HOA says it's normal. Do you think it's safe? I answered the same way. Every time, document everything. Photos, timestamps, insurance claims. Don't let the HOA bury this like they buried the trees. Meanwhile, Olivia doubled down. She blasted out an email to the neighborhood praising community resilience and warning against false information spread by disgruntled residents. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. That Friday, she staged another performance. The HOA hired contractors to lay erosion mats and stack sandbags along the slope. Olivia arrived in a neon safety vest and hard hat, strutting for the cameras. We're taking proactive measures, she declared. Safety is our top priority. I wanted to shout to expose her lies right there, but I held back. I'd learned in war and in life, sometimes you don't stop arrogance with words. Sometimes you let reality crush it. That night, I called an old friend, Erin Lowe, an investigative journalist I'd met years ago when she was covering military engineering units overseas. I sent her everything: photos, soil reports, Miller's affidavit, videos of runoff tearing through the slope. This is bad, she said on the phone, her voice low and steady. I know. If you're right and that slope gives way, she paused, there'll be hell to pay. There already is, I said. They just don't see it yet. The next morning, Erin showed up with a cameraman. She filmed drone footage of the stripped hillside, the gullies etched deep into clay, the water pooling ominously near Olivia's fence. She didn't put me on camera, I wasn't ready for that, but she captured enough. That evening she released a teaser online, Alder Ridge, when HOA ambition meets natural disaster. The video got traction fast. Not viral, but enough for whispers to spread. Olivia must have seen it, because the following day, she drove up in her shiny SUV, parked by my mailbox, and stepped out with a large manila envelope. Rain dripped off her trench coat, mascara smudged beneath her eyes. "Mr. Williams," she said, voice sharp, "we're here to deliver formal notice." She handed me the envelope. Inside, accusations of defamation, incitement, and behavior detrimental to community cohesion. The legal language was thick, but the meaning was simple: shut up or we'll bury you in court. I folded the letter and looked her dead in the eye. "You're threatening me while the slope is falling apart." "This is a warning," she snapped. "You're destabilizing the community." "No, Olivia," I said slowly. "You did that the moment you cut down those trees." For the first time, her eyes flickered with doubt. Just for a second. Then she turned and left, heels clicking against wet pavement. That night, the storm returned with fury. Rain didn't fall, it slammed. My French drains overflowed, burlap erosion fabric clung desperately to the soil, and water cascaded over the stripped slope like a waterfall. At 1:07 a.m., I heard it, not thunder, not rain, but a groan. The sound of earth shifting under pressure. The sound of bones breaking. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911. "This is Robert Williams at 314 Alder Ridge. The slope is collapsing. Mudslide imminent. Evacuate the lower homes now." The dispatcher asked questions, but I didn't wait. I pulled on my coat, grabbed my keys, and ran to my truck. My dogs howled as I slammed the door. Driving through sheets of rain, I reached the lower cul-de-sac. Olivia's lights were still on. I pounded on her door until she opened, robe clutched around her face, pale. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "You need to evacuate. Now." "You're exaggerating again." The ground shook, cutting her off. A roar filled the air, low and terrible. I turned flashlight, cutting through the rain just in time to see the hillside break loose. A wall of mud roots and stone tore downhill, ripping fences like paper, swallowing mailboxes, smashing porches. Olivia screamed. I grabbed her arm and pulled. "Run." We sprinted to the corner as the flow surged past like a freight train of sludge. Trees twisted, balconies crumbled, and in seconds Olivia's house was half buried, its windows glowing one last time before vanishing under mud. When it was over, silence fell, broken only by dripping rain and the distant wail of sirens. Olivia sat in the mud, shaking robe, torn mascara streaking down her face. She whispered the same words over and over. "No one warned us. No one warned us." I crouched beside her, hand on her shoulder. "I warned you," I said, not with anger, just truth. Red lights flashed through the storm as fire trucks and ambulances arrived. Neighbors poured into the street, phones in hand, voices high with panic. The hillside had spoken, and there was no arguing with it anymore. When the sun finally clawed its way above the ridge that next morning, Alder Ridge no longer looked like a neighborhood. It looked like a battlefield. Mud stretched across lawns, fences lay splintered like toothpicks, and 3 homes at the base of the slope sat broken, their windows shattered, their frames tilted like dominoes knocked from behind. Olivia Johnson's house, the very symbol of her smug empire, was still standing, but only halfway. The mud had swallowed its entire lower floor, burying her living room beneath a slurry of clay and snapped roots. Her luxury SUV was nowhere to be seen. I imagined it had been carried downstream, another casualty in nature's charge. I stood at the edge of the devastation, raincoat heavy on my shoulders, and took in the silence. No birds, no wind through trees, just the hollow hum of generators and the distant grind of heavy machinery. Paramedics moved cautiously through ankle-deep muck, helping stunned residents shuffle out of ruined homes. A mother clutched her child, both of them covered in mud. A man cursed quietly, staring at what was left of his garage. Beside me, a sheriff's deputy took notes, his boots sinking into the sludge. Officer Patel, I later learned mid-30s, lean, sharp-eyed, and too calm for someone staring at destruction. "You warned them?" he asked, flipping through his notebook. "Repeatedly," I said. I handed him a stack of papers sealed in a plastic folder. Deeds, environmental reports, Miller's affidavit, time-stamped photos. All of it documented. He scanned the top page, nodded slowly, then slid the folder into his bag. "Good, because this is going to get ugly." And ugly it did. By noon, news vans clogged the entrance to Alder Ridge. Reporters in raincoats shouted questions at anyone who would stop long enough to listen. Drone cameras buzzed overhead, capturing the scar of the hillside, a jagged wound where the forest used to stand. Erin Lowe, my old friend, returned with her team microphone clipped to her collar. She found me near the slope where I was raking debris off my driveway and asked if I was ready to speak. I hesitated. My instinct was to stay silent, let the evidence speak for itself. But silence hadn't worked before, had it, so I nodded. Let's do it. They filmed me against the backdrop of shattered houses and mud-soaked streets. No script, no rehearsed lines, just truth. I warned them, I said plainly. I showed them the data, the reports, the risks, but the HOA thought they could outvote nature, and nature doesn't take votes. The segment aired that evening under the headline "Veteran Warned HOA About Landslide Ignored Until Disaster Struck." Within hours, the video racked up tens of thousands of views. My inbox flooded residents from other neighborhoods, sharing horror stories of HOA, arrogance, environmental groups offering support, lawyers asking for details. Suddenly, I wasn't just Robert Williams, the quiet guy with 2 dogs. I was a whistleblower, a survivor, maybe even a reluctant symbol of what happens when people in power confuse vanity with wisdom. But victory was far from sweet. 3 days later, the HOA board called an emergency meeting in the community gymnasium. Word spread fast, and nearly every resident showed up. Mud still caked on boots, insurance forms clutched in folders, faces weary and angry. Folding chairs filled the room, news cameras lining the back wall. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting the space in a sickly glow. Olivia Johnson arrived late. Gone was her designer confidence. She wore a gray blazer, 2 sizes too large, hair pulled into a bun, makeup absent. She stepped to the podium like a soldier walking into enemy fire. Her voice trembled at first. I want to start by saying I'm sorry. What happened was a tragedy, and I take responsibility for my part in approving the project that led to this. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some bitter, some disbelieving. She pressed on. We relied on professional assessments. We acted in what we thought was the community's best interest. No one could have predicted. No, I said loudly, rising to my feet. The room went still. I held up a copy of my email, the one I'd sent 3 weeks before the landslide, stamped with date and time. I predicted it. Miller predicted it. The county had warnings on file. You ignored every single one. The silence was heavier than the mud outside. Olivia froze her mouth, half-open eyes darting toward the cameras. This wasn't an act of God, I continued, my voice steady. This was negligence. You chose aesthetics over safety, control over truth. And now families are homeless because you wanted a view. For a moment, no one spoke. Then from the back of the room, a slow clap, then another. It wasn't applause for me, it was for the truth finally being said out loud. Within minutes, the entire room was clapping, not cheering but affirming, a solidarity born out of anger and exhaustion. That night, the board voted to suspend Olivia Johnson as HOA president pending investigation. Several members resigned outright, unwilling to face the storm of lawsuits that had already begun. Insurance adjusters swarmed the neighborhood the next morning. FEMA declared Alder Ridge a localized disaster zone. And Olivia, she vanished. No more press events, no more emails dripping with condescension, just silence. But silence, I'd learned, doesn't mean peace. The rains came back a week later, heavier than before. I stood on my porch watching water roar through culverts, mud seeping across driveways. My retaining wall groaned but held. The slope above, stripped bare, patched with flimsy erosion mats, looked swollen, bloated with water. I knew the signs. One more storm, one more push, and Alder Ridge would face a second collapse. And this time, even FEMA might not be fast enough. I didn't wait for permission. I grabbed my flashlight raincoat and shouted warnings as I sprinted door to door. Slide coming, evacuate now. Some listened, some didn't. Children were bundled into cars, pets carried under arms, neighbors stumbling barefoot into the street. Then it happened. The hillside groaned a deep, resonant sound, like the earth itself breaking its ribs. The ground lurched beneath my boots. And then the slope gave way again, this time in sheets, torrents of mud tearing down what little remained. A house vanished in seconds, twisted sideways before collapsing into nothing. Another split in half, its roof peeling away like cardboard. We ran, dozens of us, huddled behind a reinforced bus shelter at the far end of the lot. The slide thundered past a freight train of dirt and roots, unstoppable, uncaring. When it was over, all that remained was silence, broken only by sobs and the hiss of rain. By dawn, the National Guard had arrived. The HOA was finished, its bank account drained, its board dissolved, its reputation buried as surely as Olivia's house. What remained was mud-broken homes and a community stripped raw. And yet in that brokenness, something else began to stir. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me now offered coffee blankets, even a hand repairing my fence. A woman named Ellen, whose backyard had been swallowed, left a pie on my porch with a note, "Thank you for not giving up on us." I stood there in the rain, pie in hand, reading her words over and over, because for a long time I had felt like I had given up. But maybe, just maybe, standing your ground doesn't always look like shouting or lawsuits. Sometimes it's just refusing to stop telling the truth even when no one listens until the earth itself forces them to. And Alder Ridge had finally listened. The days after the second landslide felt like living in a war zone, though no bullets were fired and no enemies wore uniforms. The enemy was silence, the kind that follows after the earth decides it's had enough of human arrogance. National Guard trucks patrolled the muddy streets, their tires caked in clay. FEMA trailers lined the cul-de-sac where children used to play basketball. The smell of wet soil mixed with gasoline and mildew clung to everything from ruined porches to the clothes we wore day after day. I kept moving because stopping meant letting the weight of it all crush me. I patched fences, reinforced drainage lines, shoveled debris into piles. My hands blistered and my back ached, but I welcomed the pain. It was better than the helplessness that had haunted me the night the slope broke free. The HOA was gone in everything but name. Its office sat dark papers curling on the bulletin board, fines left unsent, rules left unenforced. Olivia Johnson had vanished. Some whispered she was staying with family 2 counties over. Others claimed they'd seen her driving away in a borrowed car head low, avoiding the cameras parked outside Alder Ridge. Either way, the woman who had once ruled with clipboards and violation slips had been buried under the same mud she unleashed. Yet her absence didn't heal the wounds. Families were displaced, homes condemned, insurance claims stalled. Neighbors whispered about lawsuits, about lost savings, about whether Alder Ridge would even survive as a community. And in the middle of it all, people began to look at me differently. Not as the recluse with 2 dogs and a bow, but as the man who warned them, the man who somehow became their reluctant voice. It wasn't a role I wanted, but it came anyway. One evening, a knock at my door pulled me from a half-sleep. Ellen, the neighbor who had left me that pie, stood there with her husband. Both looked exhausted, mud still staining their jeans. She held a folder to her chest. "Robert," she said quietly, "we need your help. The county says we have to file our claims individually, but we don't even know where to start. You've been through this before." Her husband nodded. "People listen to you. You know what you're talking about. Could you guide us?" I hesitated. I wasn't a lawyer, wasn't an activist. I was just a man who'd been ignored until disaster proved me right. But then I remembered the little girl I'd seen clutching her soaked teddy bear as paramedics carried her from a ruined house. The look in her eyes, fear mixed with confusion, was the same look I'd seen in war zones in villages washed away by floods. "Bring me everything you've got," I said. "Deeds, insurance policies, photos. I'll help organize it. But this fight won't be easy." Over the next week, my living room turned into a command center. Stacks of folders lined the floor, each one belonging to a family whose life had been upended by Olivia's vanity project. Photos of cracked foundations, receipts for emergency repairs, letters from insurance companies looking for loopholes. I sorted, scanned, cataloged. My military training had taught me to build order out of chaos, and that's exactly what I did. Word spread. More neighbors showed up, some sheepishly, some desperate. One by one, they asked for help. A retired couple who'd lost their basement. A young mother whose children now slept in a motel room. Even Greg, the neighbor who once petitioned the HOA to trim my trees, knocked on my door, hat in hand. "I was wrong," he said, not meeting my eyes. I didn't understand what those trees meant. Not until now. I let him in. By the end of the week, I'd compiled enough evidence to choke a courtroom. The county received it, and so did 3 law firms. Class action lawsuits began forming like storm clouds. The HOA's emergency fund, once touted as untouchable, evaporated in legal retainers. Olivia's name appeared on every document, every signature, every email. She wasn't just negligent, she was culpable. Still, it wasn't enough to stop the land from groaning under the weight of waterlogged clay. The second slide had left the hillside jagged and unstable. Even after the National Guard stabilized parts with concrete barriers and sandbags, the slope looked angry, swollen like a bruise. And then came the storm no one was ready for. It was late afternoon when the sky turned the color of lead. Thunder rumbled like distant artillery. By nightfall, rain poured in sheets so thick I couldn't see beyond my porch. Water roared through the culverts, carving new channels into the ground. Power transformers sparked, casting blue light across the sky, then died. One by one, the street lamps flickered and went dark. My generator kicked in, humming steadily. Inside, my dogs whined, restless. I checked the security monitors. The slope above glistened under the rain, thin cracks spiderwebbing across its face. It looked like skin stretched too tight moments from tearing. I grabbed my flashlight and raincoat. My boots sank deep into the mud as I sprinted from door to door. "Evacuate," I shouted. Now the slope's going again. Some doors opened immediately, panic written on faces. Parents scooped up children clutching flashlights and bags. Others hesitated, fear rooting them in place. I banged on doors until my fists ached. 5 minutes, I yelled. Maybe less sirens wailed in the distance, emergency services racing, but they wouldn't make it in time. At the community, gymnasium families who'd been sheltering since the last slide scrambled to grab their belongings. Flashlights bobbed in the dark as people shouted names, pets barked, babies cried. I herded them toward the far end of the lot behind the reinforced bus shelter. And then the ridge gave way. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before, not thunder, not rain, but a deep bone-cracking collapse. The earth itself surrendering. Mud poured down in sheets, trees sliding like matchsticks, houses crumbling as if made of paper. A roar filled the air, drowning out screams. We huddled behind the shelter, the ground trembling beneath us. The slide tore past, unstoppable, uncaring, ripping through what little remained of Alder Ridge's pride. Balconies, fences, entire living rooms disappeared into the sludge. When it was over, silence returned. A silence so heavy it pressed against my chest. I looked around at the people, mud-streaked, terrified but alive. Against all odds, we had moved just in time. By morning, the damage was catastrophic. The hillside wasn't a slope anymore, it was a scar. Entire sections of the development were gone, swallowed. FEMA declared Alder Ridge a disaster zone. The HOA ceased to exist. And Olivia Johnson, once the queen of clipboards, had nothing left but a ruined house buried in mud and a name forever tied to failure. For me, it wasn't victory. It wasn't vindication. It was exhaustion. Standing at the edge of the destruction, I realized something. I hadn't just been fighting Olivia or the HOA. I'd been fighting the belief that rules and power could bend nature, and that fight was bigger than one neighborhood. Still, as neighbors gathered around me, people who once avoided me now thanking me, trusting me, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Because sometimes destruction isn't the end. Sometimes it's the only way a community can learn to rebuild, not with fines and bylaws, but with care, humility, and respect for the ground beneath our feet. And Alder Ridge would have to learn, or it wouldn't survive at all. The second landslide didn't just flatten homes, it flattened illusions. By sunrise the next morning, Alder Ridge was cordoned off by yellow tape sirens echoing through the valley. National Guard Humvees blocked the entrances, and satellite news trucks littered the streets. Reporters in slick rain jackets stood in front of collapsed houses, microphones trembling in the wind. Headlines ran across the state: HOA clear-cut leads to catastrophe. My phone buzzed endlessly with messages from journalists, lawyers, even HOA members from other neighborhoods who wanted to tell me, "We're going through the same thing." But all I felt was tired. Bone-deep tired. I'd fought wars overseas, watched men dig trenches in foreign soil, and I'd thought coming home meant peace. Yet here I was standing in a cul-de-sac that looked more like a combat zone than a suburban dream. Olivia Johnson was nowhere to be seen. Her house was half buried, the lower floor uninhabitable, the walls buckling under the weight of mud. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she'd been taken to the hospital in shock. Others claimed she'd slipped away in the early hours, refusing to face cameras. Either way, the woman who once wielded fines and bylaws like weapons was gone, her empire of control smothered by the very hillside she insisted on managing. The county wasted no time launching an investigation. I was summoned to meet with officials in a temporary trailer parked at the edge of the disaster zone. Inside, the air smelled of wet carpet and burnt coffee. A county engineer laid out soil reports, aerial photographs, and rainfall data. He tapped the images with a pen. "Your warnings were spot on, Mr. Williams," he said grimly. "Tree removal destabilized the slope. The rainfall was heavy but survivable if the roots had still been there." A lawyer from the district attorney's office leaned forward. "We'll need your testimony, and every document you have. This isn't just negligence, it may cross into criminal liability." I slid the manila folder across the table. "You'll find everything in there. Dates, emails, even the cease and desist letter they sent me for trying to warn the neighborhood." He raised an eyebrow. "They threatened you repeatedly." The room went silent for a moment, the weight of it sinking in. Finally, the DA's lawyer nodded. "Then we'll make sure they regret it." Back in the neighborhood, the atmosphere had shifted. Neighbors who once avoided me now stopped by with coffee blankets, even offers to help repair my fences. Ellen, the woman who had left a pie on my porch weeks earlier, brought her husband and teenage son to help me haul debris. Funny thing she said as we worked. We used to think people like Olivia kept us safe, organized. But it turns out control isn't the same as safety. I nodded. Safety is in the land, respecting it, not fighting it. Word of the lawsuit spread quickly. Individual homeowners filed claims against the HOA for property damage and negligence. A class action suit gathered momentum, names scribbled across thick petitions. Insurance companies balked at paying, arguing the disaster was an act of God. But county reports and my evidence proved otherwise. This wasn't divine wrath. This was human arrogance with a clipboard. By the second week, Olivia's assets were frozen. Her name was on every permit application, every landscaping contract, every decision that led to the slope being stripped. Without the HOA's protection, she stood exposed. And while I didn't feel joy in her downfall, I did feel relief. For too long, she'd smiled that sharp smile, confident she could bend the land and silence anyone who opposed her. Now the land had silenced her. But Alder Ridge still needed more than lawsuits and blame. It needed healing. I started small. With Miller's help, we laid out a plan to replant the slope, not with ornamental shrubs the HOA once loved, but with deep-rooted native species, sycamores, dogwoods, switchgrass, plants that could hold the clay in place, that could drink up water before it drowned the soil. We dug trenches to redirect runoff, built French drains with gravel and pipe hammered in erosion blankets. At first, it was just me, Miller, and Ellen's family. But slowly others joined. A father and his son showed up with shovels. A retired couple brought wheelbarrows. Kids carried saplings in muddy hands, their laughter cutting through weeks of sorrow. For the first time since the disasters, Alder Ridge didn't sound broken. It sounded alive. Of course, not everyone was ready to forgive or rebuild. Some neighbors sold their lots, unwilling to face another storm. Their houses, what was left of them, were marked for demolition. The county promised buyouts, though bureaucracy moved slow. One morning I watched a family drive away, their truck piled high. The words, "For sale," staked in front of what used to be their dream home. I didn't blame them. Not everyone wants to live on the edge of a wound. But those who stayed began to change. No more whispers of fines, no more HOA newsletters dictating wreath sizes or lawn heights. Instead, we talked about slope stability, drainage systems, emergency plans, real safety, real community. One afternoon, as we planted saplings near the scar, Greg, the same neighbor who once tried to petition the board against my trees, walked up beside me. He was muddy, sweaty, and uncharacteristically quiet. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice rough. I thought rules made us safe. Turns out trees did. I handed him a shovel. Then let's plant more. As weeks turned into months, the transformation was slow but visible. Green shoots sprouted where mud once smothered everything. The air smelled cleaner. The slope, though, scarred, began to look less like a graveyard and more like a rebirth. Olivia Johnson never returned. Rumor said she moved to a condo in Arizona, trying to disappear under a new name. But her absence didn't erase her impact. Alder Ridge would forever carry the memory of what happens when arrogance cuts too deep. Sometimes at night I sat on my porch watching the new saplings sway in the wind. The dogs lay at my feet, the hillside, breathing steadily again. I thought about all the battles I'd fought, the ones overseas and the one right here at home, and I realized something: wars don't always end with victory or defeat. Sometimes they end with survival and a lesson carved into the land itself. The lesson was simple: you don't own the earth, you borrow it. And if you betray it, it will take back what's owed. For Alder Ridge, the cost had been high, but maybe, just maybe, we were learning to listen at last. The lawsuits didn't trickle in, they came like floodwater, overwhelming and unstoppable. Within a month of the second landslide, Alder Ridge was less a neighborhood and more a courtroom waiting to happen. Every resident who lost a wall, a basement, or a roof had signed their name to one claim or another. A class action suit named 27 plaintiffs. Smaller individual suits stacked like bricks, each one citing negligence, endangerment, and failure of duty by the Alder Ridge Homeowners Association. At the center of it all, Olivia Johnson. I had no illusions about courts. I'd seen enough bureaucracy to know justice moves slow. But this time it wasn't just about me versus Olivia. It was about dozens of families, their lives uprooted, their savings evaporated, their trust shattered. And for once, the system seemed to listen. The county's preliminary report was damning. Tree removal had directly destabilized the slope. Rainfall levels were significant but not extraordinary. The disaster was not a freak act of nature. It was the predictable outcome of reckless decisions. Reporters pounced. The story spread beyond the county, beyond the state. National outlets ran headlines like, "When landscaping becomes liability." HOA boards in other states started reviewing their bylaws, terrified of being the next Alder Ridge. My phone buzzed daily with calls from strangers, thanking me, telling me about their own battles with homeowners associations. I hadn't meant to become a symbol, but it was too late. I was the man who had warned and been ignored, until the hillside itself roared the truth. Olivia. She stayed silent. Her house sat like a tombstone at the bottom of the slope, half swallowed in clay. Her assets were frozen, her reputation destroyed, her name cursed in every household within Alder Ridge. When the emergency board meeting voted her out of the presidency, she didn't fight it. She didn't even attend. She vanished into silence, leaving only rumors Arizona, Florida may be hiding with relatives. Wherever she wasn't here to face the music. But I didn't gloat. Truth is, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt weary. The fight had drained me, and even as the lawsuits gathered, there was still the land to heal. That hillside was more than a scar, it was a threat. Without stabilization, without roots, without respect, it could slide again, burying what little remained of Alder Ridge. So, I got back to work. With Miller's guidance, we began re-engineering the slope. Volunteers joined neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid me now showed up with gloves, shovels, and determination. Kids helped carry saplings, parents dug trenches, teenagers laid gravel for drains. The county provided seed blankets and geotextile mesh, but the sweat came from us. One Saturday morning, I stood shoulder to shoulder with Greg, the same man who once filed a complaint about my unkempt yard. Mud streaked his face, his arms straining as he hauled a wheelbarrow. He caught me watching and gave a sheepish grin. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, "but I'm glad you were stubborn." I smirked. Better stubborn than buried. We laughed, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel bitter. Still, not everyone stayed. Families who couldn't bear the risk sold their properties to the county, which offered buyouts. Entire rows of houses were demolished, leaving empty lots like missing teeth in the neighborhood's smile. It hurt to watch, but I understood. Some wounds are too deep to live beside. Meanwhile, Olivia's name kept resurfacing in court documents, in investigative reports, in whispered conversations. Journalists uncovered that her real estate license had lapsed years earlier, meaning she had no legal authority to push contracts the way she did. Contractors admitted off the record that permits had been rushed, soil surveys ignored. One by one, the pillars of her defense crumbled. The district attorney hinted at criminal charges, fraud, negligence, even reckless endangerment. But Olivia wasn't here to answer, and part of me wondered if she ever would be. As for me, the spotlight was unwanted but unavoidable. Erin Lowe returned with her crew, filming a follow-up segment. This time I let her interview me fully on camera. She asked if I felt vindicated. I shook my head. "I feel tired," I said, "because this never should have happened. Not to me, not to anyone. The land warned us. I warned them. But some people think control is the same as safety. It isn't. Control blinds you. Safety comes from listening to people, to experts, to the ground itself." The clip went viral, not because I was eloquent, but because it was true. Viewers saw the broken houses behind me, the mud caked on my boots, the exhaustion in my eyes. It wasn't a victory speech. It was a warning. And maybe that's why people listened. Weeks turned into months. The lawsuits ground on slow as glaciers. FEMA and city planners worked with us to stabilize the slope. Alder Ridge began to look less like a disaster zone and more like a construction site, ugly but at least moving forward. Where the HOA clubhouse once stood gutted by mud, a new community center took shape, funded by emergency grants. No board, no fines, no clipboards, just neighbors gathering, planning, helping. One evening, Ellen invited me to speak at the first resilience meeting. Folding chairs circled the gymnasium. Kids ran barefoot across the stage. People shared stories about evacuating in the dark, about losing keepsakes, about rebuilding. When it was my turn, I stood quietly for a moment, looking at the faces of people who had once ignored me. "I moved here for peace," I began. "After years in the military, I didn't want another battle. But sometimes peace isn't silence. Sometimes peace is listening to the land, to each other, to warnings that don't shout but whisper." No one clapped. They didn't need to. Heads nodded, eyes met mine. The truth hung in the air like a promise. That night, as I walked home under the stars, I paused at the slope. Saplings swayed gently in the breeze, their roots gripping the soil. It would take years for them to grow strong, but they were alive. The land was healing, and maybe, just maybe, so were we. Olivia Johnson would forever be remembered as the president who cut down a forest and buried herself in mud. I would forever be the man who warned. But Alder Ridge, it had a chance to be something better if we remembered the lesson carved into our hillside. You don't own the earth, you live with it. And if you forget that, it will remind you in ways you'll never forget. By the time summer arrived, Alder Ridge no longer looked like the neighborhood I had moved into years ago. The hedges manicured to identical heights were gone, replaced by sandbags and straw netting. The once pristine clubhouse had been gutted, its polished glass doors shattered by mud. Children played not in trimmed lawns but on plywood planks laid over unstable ground. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. For the first time, Alder Ridge was not pretending. The lawsuits advanced steadily. County investigators published their final report, and it read like an indictment carved in stone. The HOA's tree removal directly destabilized the slope rainfall, merely accelerated what was already inevitable, and repeated warnings, including, my own, were ignored or dismissed. There was no wiggle room, no spin that could save Olivia Johnson's legacy. She never returned to Alder Ridge. Rumor placed her in Arizona, hiding in a condo with the blinds drawn her once sharp name, now spoken only with bitterness. But even from afar, her presence lingered. Every news story carried her face, the blonde helmet of hair, the smile she used like a weapon. Her name became shorthand for HOA arrogance. Don't pull an Olivia, one commentator quipped, and the phrase stuck. I didn't care to follow her downfall, though I knew it was happening. Her accounts were frozen, her reputation destroyed, her future a long series of courtrooms and settlements. What mattered to me wasn't Olivia, it was the land. I spent my mornings walking the slope with Miller, my geotechnical friend. We studied drainage channels, measured cracks, checked the anchoring of erosion mats. Slowly, green returned. Native grasses sprouted in tufts, saplings stretched fragile limbs toward the sun, and wildflowers, resilient, defiant, poked through the scar like little flags of survival. Each shoot felt like a promise, not just from the land, but from ourselves. Neighbors joined in. Families who once kept to themselves now worked side by side, planting, hauling, learning. Kids painted wooden signs with messages like "Grow strong and rooted here." One boy, maybe 8 years old, looked at me as we planted a dogwood and asked, "Do you think the trees will forgive us?" I paused, swallowed hard, and answered truthfully, "Trees don't hold grudges, but they remember. Our job is to remember too." The county, impressed with the grassroots effort, granted us funding for a long-term restoration project. Not a development, not an overlook, but a stewardship program. Imagine that Alder Ridge, once the poster child of control and arrogance, transformed into a case study of humility and resilience. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months passed, and life, messy, imperfect, resumed. Families moved back into repaired homes, FEMA trailers emptied, and the sound of hammers and saws replaced the sirens. But there was no HOA anymore. The board had dissolved its bylaws, void its bank account drained by settlements. In its place, a committee formed not of presidents and enforcers, but of volunteers. We met on Saturdays, coffee in hand, mud still on our boots, to decide what mattered: safety, community, respect for the land. It wasn't order, not the way Olivia liked it. It was better. It was human. One evening, Ellen stopped by with her husband. She carried a thermos of cider and a folded piece of paper. "This came today," she said, pressing it into my hands. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, but shaky. I was wrong. I thought control meant safety. I thought silence meant peace. But the earth doesn't listen to bylaws. It only listens to respect. I hope the land forgives me someday. I hope you will too. No signature, but it didn't need one. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into the same drawer where I kept the original land deeds. Strangely, I felt no anger reading it, only pity. Olivia had wanted to build something lasting, but in the end, the only legacy she left was a cautionary tale. The following spring, Alder Ridge held its first harvest day. No HOA permits, no polished speeches, just picnic tables, borrowed speakers, apple pies, and muddy boots. Kids carved their names into wooden garden signs, families shared food, and for once, laughter filled the air without tension lurking beneath it. I stood near the slope, a mug of cider in hand, watching children roll down the soft grass of a hill that once threatened to bury them. Beside me, Ellen asked, "Do you think it's over?" I looked out at the saplings swaying in the breeze. Not over. Different. Stronger. Because the truth wasn't in the lawsuits or the headlines. It was in the soil, in the roots, returning in the people learning to listen. Alder Ridge had been broken, yes, but sometimes breaking is the only way to rebuild something real. For me, it was never about victory. It was about survival and respect. About remembering that the earth doesn't care about our rules or our pride. It doesn't need our permission. It only needs us to listen. And if we do, maybe just maybe, it lets us stay. This story isn't just about a neighborhood or an arrogant HOA president. It's about what happens when we mistake control for wisdom, when we think rules can outmatch the laws of nature. Olivia Johnson believed she could cut down a forest and pave over its roots without consequence. She learned too late that the land always has the last word. In life, we're all tempted to believe we're in control. But real strength comes from humility, from listening to warnings, from respecting the things bigger than ourselves. Whether it's a hillside forest, a fragile relationship, or our own health, ignore the signs and collapse will come. So I ask you, have you ever ignored a warning you should have listened to? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear it. And if this tale struck you, subscribe to the channel. There are more HOA dramas, more lessons, and more stories worth remembering. Because sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought quietly with roots instead of rules.